Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here with another product conversations. Steve, I caused a little controversy, I guess, this week with my. I put the graphic out there for end of life with my picture, and Saeed and Graham Rowe all came on. I'm like, oh my God, is everything okay? But it was not the end of my life. It's about a conversation talking about the end of lives of products. And
Yeah, maybe retire is a better way of
Sounds
talking
sad.
about it.
so after Saeed gave me some suggestions. I didn't take them, but this is an idea May brought up, and actually, it's something that long time ago when we first started doing these product conversations, when we called them topic of the week in the community. One of the first ones we did, and still one of my favorite conversations ever, was on toughest product management decisions. Jon Harmer actually was on that call, and there was some consensus that the toughest product management decisions people have made, if they have made them, were end of life decisions for your product, obviously. You've been around so long. Your thoughts on end of life? You think it's the toughest?
Well, I think it is a tough decision. I mean, certainly in my case, I was getting ready to recommend that we retire my product, the only product I had. And I was really, a little worrisome that they would say, oh, we're going to retire you as well. But I think more difficult than making the decision is selling it. The case I'm thinking of is our president apparently got drunk somewhere and came back with an acquisition. And I'm a simple guy when it comes to strategy. It's like solves the problem, leveraging our capabilities in way that are different in some way than the competitor. This product did not solve a problem and did not leverage any of our capabilities. Different buyer, different scenario. It was a bad idea. And, that means don't make business decisions while you're drunk. But on top of that, the developers didn't like working on it. The salespeople didn't understand it. There was no one inside the organization who was really supporting it except the president. So basically, I sat down with the president and said, I think we better kill this thing. Do I still work here? and just, selling the idea that something has reached the end of life or the end of retirement or whatever. It was an easy decision to make. It was a difficult one to sell.
That resonates with me, and when I post on this, it sort of was where I was as well. Well, we've got a great panel here to talk about it. We've got Jon Harmer, who I mentioned earlier, he was on a call last year with the Airbnb stuff because he wrote a Grow blog, but he used to be one of the regulars when we were first getting this started. We've got May Wong, who is the regular. She's always here, and she, my co-host on this. And we've got Katya Tyukina. Did I say that right?
Almost.
Almost right? Okay. And what we're going to do is have a great conversation on the idea of end of life. And, first thing I want to throw out there is, how do you make an end of life decision, right? It's a tough decision. How do you make one? What are you thinking about?
I think that's the wrong question. It's not how you make an end of life decision. It's when do you start planning for end of life? Because everything must come to an end at some point in time, right?
Yeah.
So, what are the triggers that get you to start thinking about it? Like, I think when we talk about end of life, almost always it's reactive, right? It's like, oh, I guess this thing is dead now. Maybe we should start doing something about it. Or I think we're approaching death, but like by then it's because you've already had 27 symptoms show up, right? That everyone is already struggling with it. There's no one who's able to support it. Maybe you've already lost the code base to that version of the product, whatever it might be. Through several acquisitions, this might have happened. And it's really important to start saying, like, when you launch a product, like perhaps put in some contingency for maybe these are the signs that we should look for where we trigger some sort of review, right? Because like when we talk about what we do as product managers, we're responsible for the business success of the product. And almost always when we talk about product management, it's always about what do we do next? How are we improving it? But there is a time where it plateaus and you're not really making that much investment. And then it kind of tapers off over time, or maybe there's like some organic growth, but eventually you'll hit that tapering off. And so once you hit that tapering off, but the profit, um, the profit and the revenue requirements are still there, like that, there's this intrinsic conflict. And so if we plan for it ahead of time, then you stop trying to squeeze blood from a stone and you say like this is kind of the expected lifespan of this thing, or this is what we're going to revisit it at this time, or whatever it might be.
Hypothetically, I agree. Every time I've walked into this situation, and it's been me coming in from the outside, sort of like Steve, they're handing me a product and I get in there and I do the sort of due diligence, and the due diligence says, oh, why is this thing still going? So I think, again, ideally, and I said in the post, it should happen naturally as part of the product lifecycle management. But if you're not doing that, how do you help people make those decisions? Katya, I know you've been through this.
Yeah, so May, it sounds so sad. Like, you launch a product and like immediately you start thinking about how you are going to kill it. It's like, gosh, that's like, from my perspective, this is why these decisions are tough, because it's so sad, right? So like all these emotions behind these decisions. So from my perspective, I kind of agree and disagree, because in my situation, it's just everyday work of you as a product manager, right? So apparently one day you are doing this like every day, like thinking about market, checking what is going on, like the cost of the development, something like that. You go through your checklist of all these triggers, right? So all these ideas, and one day you understand that like your company is wasting time and money, right? So okay, that's nothing wrong with that. I mean, nothing wrong with the decision of sunsetting the product. And also the plateau could take like different time for different products, right? For one product, it could be 15 years. Again, like that's great. And when do you plan? The beginning of this 15 years, in the middle of this 15 years, at the end of this 15 years. So it's all about kind of one day you understand, okay, we're wasting time, money, and you prepare the case, right? And you go to your stakeholders with that, saying, hey, this is kind of not the opportunity of launching something new. It's quite the opposite. So
it's interesting. I was talking to a head of product who worked for an elevator company, and they literally had elevators in the field that were still 100 plus years old.
Right.
And it's tough sometimes. It's because even when you end of life something, you still may have this ecosystem of stuff that's still out there, people who are still using it. And at what point do you feel like you have a responsibility to that versus not? It's tough. John, I'd love to get your take.
Well, we'll bring up some interesting points around the difference between hardware and software end of life.
Yeah.
So like hardware end of life is, I want to say, easier, although you're talking about a 100-year-old elevator. But like, the iPhone, they have some defined like version X and below is not going to be supported anymore. Google does the same thing with the Pixels, stuff like that. That seems, I want to say, easier. Maybe it's hard to make the decisions when that cutoff is. But overall, that seems like an easier thing, especially when you've trained people to buy a new thing in 18 to 24 months, which is its own set of problems. But like especially for things that are software as a service, like theoretically long-lived services that people bake into if you think of the B2B case or even a B2C, like they bake into their workflows, they bake into their day, like this is how they get things done. It's a super difficult decision. And I don't know many people who try to plan for their thing to go away when they're trying to make their thing more and better, right? So May's point about like you should be able to do that is totally true, but also counterintuitive to most. And it only gets slightly easier if you have a clean replacement. So my first product job was also this problem. Like, it's funny to read both your posts about this. I was like, hey, me too. I was brought into, what I was told I was brought in was to launch a new email service. And then I get in and I find out and kill the old email service. Right. So I had to deprecate a thing as part of launching a new thing. And people hate change. And so there's this whole giant migration process, and not just our customers hating change, but like the company itself, our operations teams, like were barriers to moving forward time and time again in ways that were like made sense for the business, but like made it very hard to turn people off. Like, we can have no customer impact. I'm like, you can't have no customer impact. We're changing the way they do things. Like, there's going to be customer impact. And so you have a whole bunch of stakeholders here, not just your customers potentially, that you have to convince about all of these plans and paths forward, and that even the deprecating is a good idea. So yeah.
And they all happen to probably be users of the product too.
Frequently they are, yeah.
So I think there's like a couple of different types of end of life, right? So there's what we call end of marketing, or like basically when you stop selling it, or you at least stop publicly selling it. You might still sell it. There's end of marketing and a sales. If those might be different depending on where you are or what you're doing. Like if clearance sales, like that kind of falls under end of marketing. There's end of support, where you say, well, we can't actually support this thing anymore because nobody makes this specific part anymore. It's actually impossible to manufacture for whatever reason, right? And then there's the actual, like, this thing is dead. We're going to cut off access to it because it's a SaaS service or whatever it might be. Or yeah, so I think there's different types, and oftentimes it can come in multiple of these, because we had, like, for example, if you're selling an on-prem software, it's being used on their servers, and if they have a perpetual license, they can use it forever, right? But the difference is you won't support it. So like I think the hardest part about end of life is it's not just the sentimental value, not just the internal people impact, not just your customer impact, but also your revenue impact. Because half the time, like you're saying, we're going to cut off this revenue stream, and if it's like a huge percentage of it, or it's like a component that is very customer facing, like that's always a struggle, no?
No, completely.
You better have a really good story for what you're replacing it with in that cash cow scenario.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, it gives me this idea of Computer Associates, or CA, as they rebranded, right? They sort of would buy those software things that you can stop development on, and they just were, making money on maintenance fees, right? So if there are people still using it and you can do that, but to May's point, is that end of life. And so there's the end of life as I'm going to stop developing on it. There's the end of life that I'm going to stop marketing and selling it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the end of life that I'm going to stop supporting it. And if they're on-prem and they have it and they choose to do it themselves, maybe that happens. Steve, I'd love to get your take. You probably end of life more things before I was born than.
Well, I kind of was reflecting on sort of a different thing. I like to say that all of us as employees are free agents. And I think once a year, if not more often, you should be asking yourself, is this the team I want to play for? Because your boss does,
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same is true with products. It's like every year when you do your annual business review, you should say, is things going good or is they not? Are things getting better or worse? And and we should take a business view of it. Yeah. So as a result, it's like it's not necessarily a trigger event as much as just looking at the numbers. Revenue has been stable or declining over the last 3 years. the salespeople, well, it doesn't really matter what the conditions are, but looking at the finances, you just go, this is not a good fit for us anymore. And yet, to kind of a point May was making, I was talking to a product manager who sold something that was related to nuclear power stations. And, they weren't selling that many units. And yet this was the only part that was available that had already been certified by the atomic, whatever it is. And so they were like, well, we can't continue to offer this at this price. And they're like, we don't care what the price is. So they were able to reimagine, the product as a special needs situation, but price it in such a way that they could afford to continue its life. So it's not always kill the product. It may very well be that for this market segment, it's actually doing well, but it's time to take it out of the sales guy's commission plan.
Well, and it's, in that hardware type realm, there's going to be times where there's unsupported products, and it's like, it may not make sense for me to support it in my P&L, but if there's a special use case, and I've seen this in the defense industry, in the aerospace industry, and that type of stuff, where there were that type of stuff where they would make those tough decisions, and there's a place where the business has to make the decision. This doesn't make sense for us anymore, and product management should be playing a key role there. Then it's a chance to, if there is this, unique customer, to have that conversation with them, because they may say they want to work it. It's interesting, Michael Fox, and I just found out this cool new thing I can do. I can put one of the comments up on the screen when we do it.
Which disturbed me. I lost my train of thought.
I didn't know what it was going to do, and it did it. And then Steve got distracted, and I felt bad. But I figured I should do it now because now I know how to.
Squirrel.
But it was interesting what Michael was talking about, is that there's this idea that end of life for our company may not be end of life for a different company. And so as we make decisions, there may be somebody who's willing to buy that product and it's a good enough business for them. And it sort of goes back to the CA model I was talking about, where they would buy up mature businesses that were declining and just put no money into development or even maintenance, and just rack up the prices.
I would even argue, Grant, that took courage. CA or Allen Systems Group or other three-letter company names had the courage to put it on life support. But there, the original developers are still there, and they're still saying, "Oh, but if we add AI, we can reinvigorate this thing that nobody is buying." And you're like, somebody has to step up and say, "This is no longer a good business for us," and cut it back to where it belongs.
Just imagine the Facebook Marketplace for old products, right? Gosh.
We could put our old product on and somebody could buy it, and they can. That might not be a bad private equity model.
Okay, guys, I'll go to investigate this idea.
John, I wanted to ask you a question. Google is known for the graveyard, right?
Sad but true, yeah.
But it means they're making decisions. They're learning quickly. They're making decisions. Is there a, method to it?
I wouldn't say that there's like a one Google way that these things happen. It takes into account a lot of the things we've talked about, like what could we redeploy these resources to instead? And is the opportunity cost of keeping this thing around, higher or lower than what we could do with those resources pointed in a different direction?
Yeah.
Whether that's, development resources for advancing functionality or even just support or infrastructure or any of the costs that are associated with that, right? So in an ideal world, we're doing it all based on those kinds of things. It's not always that. There's often various strategic reasons, like, you have 4 or 5 of the similar problem space solutions. Like we get made fun of for the multiple chat apps we had with Allo and Duo and Chat and Hangouts and all that for a while. Like at some point, you just have to decide that's silly. We need to do fewer of these things. But that was a lot of it was part of the nature of the way Google came up, which was tons of autonomy pushed down, product teams allowed to solve problems they want to solve in ways they want to solve them without a ton of central coordination. That's what happens. And eventually you have to sort it out. But then you get a reputation for it. So,
well, it's not just Google. I mean, Microsoft has a graveyard too. I think any fast-moving, fast-growing company is going to, because you're placing some bets, and not all of them are going to fit. I want to sort of bring this a little bit out. We've talked a little bit about this, but what do you need to consider when making an end-of-life decision? You know, whether it's like some of us have said in the past, we come in and we inherit a product that's like, oh, wow, it's dead. We need to do a decision, or something more utopian like May's idea that you start planning for the end of the life at the beginning. You know, Tao says the journey of start with the end in mind, right? I guess that was Stephen Covey. What things should we be considering when we're thinking about an end of life decision? Katya?
Alternatives for everyone, right? So like for every party that participate in the whole software development idea, your customer success, you start this conversation with sales about like, oh, actually you're not going to sell this thing, but you are going to sell this thing, right? For customers, the same. So, okay, maybe we will remove this part, but we will bring you this one. So you go like stakeholder by stakeholder, point by point, and think about all the alternatives. This is one part. The second one, actually three pieces, right, in my head. The second one is what I figured out kind of hard way, risk management. So something you would never believe exists in your business operations, like legal contracts you cannot break. You know, vendors you cannot just say bye-bye. That's impossible. It will cost you so much money. Something like that, right? Just risk management is crucial then, like for end of life. And maybe it's not a popular one. Like my third piece is like people's emotions. You have to think about that. That's all like attachments and emotions, and you eventually will deal with that. So if you think about that, if you consider it at the very beginning, how you are going to communicate this, with whom you are going to communicate this, right? So how you will talk with your stakeholders, that could help. That's my favorite.
I love that. And I think that one you talked about with unknown contracts and agreements and stuff, you know, it all factors in, because if you have a 5-year contract with somebody to provide something, there's risk there. I think, you know, things that you might not be thinking about. May, building on that, what do you need to consider when making the end of life decision?
So Katya and I actually had a conversation about product sunset at my event with a large group of people. And so I asked the question, how many of you here, and these are our product managers, how many of you here have read a sales contract? And everyone raised their hand, because we were all the people who showed up to the product end of life session. Now, like if you go to most product managers and ask them the same question, very few of them would have, because you've never had to deal with a situation where you want to know the context of what you've sold. And I think like a huge part of product management is understanding what your product is, and that includes what you've sold. And so like as a person who've written sales contracts, like how what is how much of the product should we know, right? And in order to get to the point where we are able to say, you know, here's the comprehensive understanding of what we need to do to basically retire this product, I think there is that element of like, it's not just the technical aspects of retiring the product, it's not just the functional or even legal or financial aspects of this, it's all of the above, plus how your customers feel about it, because if this is a major, like the front end component they've been using for the last decade, you might have problems, right? Like, how are you going to keep the majority of your customer base if you're withdrawing a major component? How are you going to keep them happy? Are you ready to take that hit on your existing subscription revenue in order to make this change, because maybe you don't even have developers who understand the component anymore, right? So that's
Yeah.
the situation I found myself in a long time ago, and this is why I care about this topic, because if we had planned for it ahead of time, then maybe we wouldn't have been in this situation at all.
I mean, and you brought out the term sunset, and I'd use that in my post. It took me working at a standards company where they're really thinking about, like with standards, there's a long period of time, and they do a sunset and sunrise. For those of you who maybe it's not everybody's timeline, it's mine because I worked there. I worked at GS1 US, which was the UPC barcode or EAN barcode, and they're now coming out with a 2D data matrix, which is a 2D barcode, which is going to be able to do a lot more with it. But they're in the sunsetting of the UPC code, and in terms also the sunrise of the 2D barcode, and that's like hell, we were planning it 10 years. We were thinking about it 10 years ago, 10 plus years ago. They've just started implementing it, and it's still like a 3-year sunset, just to get everybody, because you have to change that whole bunch of stuff. Scanners have to be able to do it, those types of things. And I think for me, that was one of the biggest ahas I had, because when I have end of life to product, it was this, it's already dead, right? If we can get to it and plan for it, right? And this idea, and I've worked with many clients on migrations, right? One of the hardest things is actually end of lifing that legacy product, right? There's still people hanging on, and I haven't seen many companies do well with it. It's a struggle. Jon, I'd love to get your take before I go to Steve on this. What do you need to consider? What else do you need to consider?
There's brand impacts you need to think about, right? If you don't handle it well, you lose user trust. You can lose customers from other products, even like that are potentially unrelated to this product if you sell a suite of things.
Yeah.
And then there's like increased efficiencies for your support organization that are a potential for not having to support the painful old thing.
Yeah.
And then increased development velocity if there's a ton of technical debt in the old thing. And so any work on it is harder. Start working on a new thing. In theory, that should be faster. So there's lots of tangential
ancillary
ancillary things to consider. Yeah.
Awesome. Steve, wrapping up on that question, anything to need to consider that hasn't been?
I keep coming back to, does the problem still exist? Is there a market problem that we're solving? Are we capable of addressing that problem? And are we doing it in a way that is differentiated from our competitors? And actually, I'm reminded of Google Reader, which I, absolutely loved. And I think at some point they said, Steve and Jon are the only two people left using RSS. So we're getting out. It's no longer an issue in the market, even though it was everybody's preferred reader. So is it still a problem? Is it leveraging our capabilities, and are we doing it in a way that is unique enough that we can continue offering it?
I guess end of life, which brings it to end of life, really is it end of solving this problem, or is it end of this product solving this problem, and what the next solution is? And
which is also about, our capabilities and differentiation. If, like, I know the guys at Google are a little bit worried about us just not never again searching. We're just going to, I did it the other day where I would normally have gone into Google. I went straight into ChatGPT and asked, how do you reboot a Mac M1? And it said, oh, here's what you want to do. And, it's amazing how little I search now.
Yeah. But I guess the key is, like, are we just getting out of this business, or are we trying to move people to something else? And those are like you handle those two situations totally differently, right? A migration, and I'd love to Karen put in the chat. Now that I know how to use this feature, I'm going to keep using it. How do you handle the conversation with leadership when the older products have been replaced, but they still have enough revenue that they don't want to lose the client base for the risk of migration? And this is what I've seen. I've seen companies build the new platform.
Courage. I swear, no, it's like it's an absolute absence of courage. I'm sorry. Back to you, Grant. I interrupted you. You were going to say something meaningful.
I probably was, but I don't remember what it was. I think what I've seen at a lot of companies is they do the next gen platform and they do the migration of 90% of the people, and then the last 10% of people don't want to move. And these have been customers for a long time, and nobody has the courage to make the tough decision.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But
that we haven't brought up yet is the fastest way to end the life of a product is to stop paying commissions.
And
John then
marketing, not end of life.
Yeah,
just
end of sales
because
and marketing.
you stop selling it doesn't mean you stop supporting it.
That is the tricky differentiation. Yeah.
You were going to say something earlier, John?
I forgot what it was. The other thing that I was about to say, though, was as we think of examples of this, think of the Netflix example where they go from DVDs to streaming, right? That is the Steve thing of this problem no longer needs solving. We're going to solve a different problem. It's a similar problem, right? People getting entertainment in homes, but the method of doing it is fundamentally different now than it was. And they had to figure out a way to cut that off and start the new thing. They tried to spin it off into, I think it was called Quickster. And that was a disaster of an attempt. And so they just sort of like let it slowly fade away to nothingness.
Yeah.
My favorite example,
taking that thought as well, Apple's really good at just simply one day saying, oh yeah, we don't like DVDs anymore. So they're not in any of our computers.
Which ended up being the downfall of software delivered that way.
Right?
Ultimately, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite example of a really good product end of life was when GitHub retired Subversion support. So what they did was they would have planned announced brownouts for first like an hour at a time, and then a day at a time, and then a whole weekend at a time. And they would say, and they would get like the users would get a notification that says, "Hey, we're retiring this product at this date, and you're never going to be able to access this again. So do your migration as soon as possible, or else you'll like never see your stuff again."
And the brownouts were basically just like trial versions of it being fully deprecated so that you could test to make sure you did anything right. I love that. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
And it also is a gentle nudge to people, right? It gives them they know something's coming. They have to do it.
Exactly. So I think like there are ways to do support. So when I went through that first end of life or like product sunset experience, it was a lot of work. Like there was so much planning with support because our support team understands the support timelines, right? They know what they're on the hook for. And so working with them to understand what the timelines are and what's realistically how much time your customers need to plan for that migration, plan to replace it. Like we had a replacement product, but you had to buy it because there was another layer of issues corporately speaking. But what happened was we had to send out the notices a year in advance. And then on top of that, we had to keep selling extended support for another couple of years. But at the same time, like there were layoffs. We had to the organization let go of the last customer or last developer who knew how to develop on this like important component of the subcomponent that was being retired. And it was quite the struggle because every time something went wrong with that, we either had to say we won't fix it, or we had to like spend a whole lot of developer time where they need to relearn that component and figure it out from scratch. And so all of that stuff came together where there was this urgency, and over time there will be this urgency because like people retire, people move on, and you can't retain that institutional knowledge. And at some point in time, your workarounds are like magic. And if you lose the people who know how to do the workarounds, you've lost that magic. Like there's no amount of documentation that will fix it. That's like if you're talking about a 5-year-old or 10-year-old product, and if you're dealing with enterprise customers, you're probably talking about that 10-year-old product. And
Or
how
more.
many people in tech companies stay at their company for 10 years in the same organization?
I'm reminded of an old joke about Silicon Valley. Is the real cause for the growth of Silicon Valley was that programmers were required to maintain code that they wrote at HP for their lifetime. And so, it'd be 3 o'clock in the morning and you'd get a tech support call for some code you wrote 15 years ago that you've long ago forgotten. And the only way to get out of it was to quit and start your own company. And the explosion of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley is directly the result, it was said, of having to support your own code for the life of your employment at HP.
That is the first time I've heard that story, Steve. I think this is the first time you've told a story that I had not heard on Product Conversations.
There we go.
I thought you were going to go to the fact that like there's COBOL programmers who are probably getting $1,000 an hour now because of the fact that they.
Assuming there are any left.
Right. So, next question I wanted to ask, what's the biggest mistake companies make when it comes to end of life?
Bad communication.
Right. Yeah. Not talking. Right. No transparency.
To the customers, to each other?
I mean, it probably across the board, but particularly I think is most painful when it's bad communication to customers. And the cynic in me says that this is likely due to the fact that you're afraid of how customers are going to react. And so you put it off, or you don't put the necessary time and effort into it that you should, or you underestimate how impactful it is to them because you've already moved on or whatever. That can be just an utter disaster.
I think it's helpful to think of retirement as a form of launch. It's an unlaunch. All the things that you did to launch the product, you have to undo.
In reverse.
That's absolutely true. So it's not just communication with customers, communication with your stakeholders, right? So if you hide in information, if you are not transparent enough with decisions, if you are not sitting like and talking and like discussing and ask them to sign all these plans in blood, with blood, that's the biggest mistake.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that gets me back to my other one, which is courage.
Right.
We made this decision. Let's let the decision be made and support it going forward, and not at the last minute go, oh, but it was big customer X.
Yeah.
So I think what's missing from this conversation, though, is Grant's favorite word, which is strategy. Because when you...
I thought you were going to say Drucker, because I did have a Drucker quote earlier I could have pulled in. I didn't, because Drucker did say, you should always look at your business as if we weren't in this, would we get into it? And that's sort of like what Steve said like 30 minutes ago. But
yeah,
strategy, Drucker, they're both up there.
Yeah. So like, this is a strategic decision, right? Think about all the time your people spend worrying about the issues coming out of this product that's like building that technical debt, and you're not investing in it, generally speaking, by the time this comes around. Or maybe you are, but you can't invest in things that are valuable versus things that are overwhelmingly burdensome. So you're the balance of like being able to achieve your strategic goals is poor. And like there at some point in time, like take a step back and looking at the overall landscape of what you have to say, like, we're not going to get more developers. And it really doesn't make sense that for the 10 developers on this team, basically the equivalent of 8 of them are fixing really old issues that we can't really address, like, because we did the architecture wrong 20 years ago, right? And I think it's important to just take a step back and say, like, well, what is it that we want to do as an organization? Where do we want to go? And can we get there with what we have today? And if not, what are the decisions that we need to make? Right? And like, this is a part of the product management that, like, nobody really wants to touch, because a lot of the time, like, when we talk about product management, it's always hyper focused on this, well, this is my domain and this is my product, and therefore I must incrementally improve this thing, or like, and these are my goals, right? But really, it's about the whole portfolio and how it all works together to get to those goals. And this is why it's really interesting in product organizations where the PMs aren't responsible for a component, but they are responsible for driving a subset of the strategy that they actually want to achieve. And then it changes the language in which they talk. So it's like, I'm not responsible for the payments platform, I'm responsible for payments. And so you can say, like, we need to build a new payments platform, for example.
Yeah, I think where I was going with what was the biggest mistake is that you're not planning for it, right? That too often I see companies get to the point where, they're losing money, right? It's all the way past mature and into decline, and it's going down, and they're just not making the decision. It's hard because whether the revenue is 5 million, 50 million, or 500 million, it's always hard for people to, like, well, at least I'll take that, right? Oh, I'll still take that. And they just keep kicking the can down the road. But to your point, May, I think, and this goes back to your original point at the opening, we have to be thinking about this. If we are doing product management well with success metrics and guides and visions, right, we should be able to say, here are the metrics, here are the things, here are the actions that happen that make us starting to think about end of life, right? I've often told, Charles Handy talks about second curves. And the way he talks about second curves is he tells a story about he was in Avoca in Ireland, and he was driving to get to Avoca, and he was lost in the fields. And a guy walking a dog, he stopped and goes, "Can you help me get to Avoca?" And he goes, "It's very easy. Go up the hill, down the hill. You're going to cross the river, and you're going to see a bar. It's Johnny's Bar, big sign, Johnny's Bar. Half a mile before you get there, turn right." And the problem is, too often, by the time we get to where we should start the end of life process, we should have done it half a mile 2 years ago, whatever it may be. And so if we're building good product management practice and good product lifecycle management, there should be tough questions at some point when your growth slows to single digits and your price increase is your only growth that you have, maybe even a little before you price it. When your growth slows, and you're still getting some organic thing, but price increase is helping some, that's when you probably should start talking about it, right? Now, it still maybe 5, 10, 15 years, but it's like, okay, we're penetrated.
And that's
what are we looking for?
Of three horizons, right? It's all products go through that S curve, and you need to take the money from the cash cow to pay for your next gen, or when the cash cow dies, you'll have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mixed in some BCG metaphors there.
McKinsey, BCG, all of them coming together. Sorry, stalled for a second. So what's our advice? I guess I kicked into this. What's the best practice for doing it? I'd love to, if you could give advice to somebody who's never dealt with it, us all being people who've dealt with it before, what's your advice to, a product manager comes up to you at Product TO, and I'm going to put a plug in for Product TO, the single best in-person product event I've ever been to. Thank you, May. I got a chance to speak there last year. If you're ever want to go to Toronto, check out the schedule. Go, and this is it. They didn't. Product TO is not sponsoring us. This is me just doing it. But somebody comes up to you at Product TO and they're like, "Oh God, I saw that end of life episode on Product Conversations," because everybody watches Product Conversations, and they're like, yeah, "I just inherited a product. You know, I think it's time to start thinking about this. What should I be thinking about? You know, how should I do this?" Katya.
I just gave this advice to my friend 2 weeks ago. Actually.
I thought you were going to say, "Go talk to May." But
No. It's and we met in Product TO actually. So that's funny. That's really similar to what Steve mentioned about unlaunching, right? So just think about like what you would do to launch a new product. Do the same. Just think about how you would unlaunch it. So you start with, then you launch products, right? You start with the opportunity. You are like in discovery stage. Okay, what's the problem we are solving? What's the market response, right? So what customers we are like working with? Same idea, but just in reverse. And taking into account all the previous advice I gave about like risk management, legal contracts, right? So people's behind. But the same, so how we would unmarket it, how we would unsupport it, how we would do this, and this. What about attrition? Like, do we have enough knowledge? How do we communicate this stuff? So the same things you do with the like launching products, do we have engineers with proper skills?
Yeah.
Would we keep engineers with proper skills, right? So it's pretty the same checklist. So it's kind of a lot just for one advice, but that's what we talked about with my friend, right?
No, I love it. That's great. John.
I mean, it is a lot. This whole sort of unlaunching plan, which I love that concept of unlaunching. I think the potential difference in an unlaunch from a launch, just done backwards, is providing that path forward. Like, we're not doing this for you anymore in this way, but instead, here's what you should do. And doing that in a clear and compassionate way and showing you user empathy and all the product things, I think is probably some of it ties back to that. You mess it up by not communicating well, communicating with compassion and empathy. I think that's probably the thing I would layer on to what Katya was saying.
Well, and I think the helping them with a path forward, and I remember an example on a course I used to teach where they talked about sometimes you release things for your competitors and sometimes it's for partners. And when Microsoft Money finally gave up trying to compete with Quicken, one of the things they did is they did a migration tool to help people migrate their money stuff to Quicken, right? And so, again, it sort of goes back to Steve's original question in the middle there somewhere, not original, but is the problem still there? Does it still need to be solved? Do they need that path? So I love that. May.
When you're retiring a product, you have a portfolio, right? By then you have a portfolio, unless you're killing the whole company. That's a different thing. But if you're
that's actually a very good observation.
When you're retiring a product, you have a portfolio, and therefore, whatever you're retiring, you need to make sure you protect your revenue stream, right? So even if you don't have a replacement, kind of going back to what you said, Grant, it is still a migration somewhere else. It's a migration to working without that component. It's a migration to working with another component that you're building. It's a migration to getting them to buy that extra component, maybe because in order to fund the building of the new thing, you had revenue goals to make, even though retaining support doesn't count towards those revenue goals in a specific company. And so there are many, many things to consider as a part of this, right? And it depends on how long that component's been around. Like, you might have support obligations, whatever it might be. But if you think about it as not just an unlaunch, but the launch of how you're going to, the launch of the new product without this component. What does that look like? And what does that look like for your existing customer that have this component? What does it look like in your sales and marketing, right? It's holistically, strategically, what is your portfolio strategy without that one mini product or component, whatever it might be? Um, and fundamentally, like there are many different aspects of it, but the first question you have to answer is why, right? You might feel this way, but feelings aren't good enough. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it comes back down to cost. I think people in the chat were talking about like this is a finance driven decision half the time. um, as you see the revenues decline, you can project that. You can talk to your customers and say, and they're going to tell you they're going to stop. They're going to stop paying for your product. You can project that and say, this is the expenses are increasing expenses and are decreasing revenue, and we need to end of life before it hits here and
Mhm.
stop it while we're still making money. And then think about what your product looks like without it.
No, I get it. And actually, Marlon had just put in the comments, Marlon Davis going on LinkedIn. When I was a product manager or director of product management or VP of product management at large multinational companies, I had a number I was given. If one product in my portfolio was going down, I had to find a way to make up for it with something else. And so in the end, we're still managing to those numbers. So, Steve, any thoughts?
Well, as y'all were talking, I was thinking of another word that I like a lot, which is friction. And as you start thinking about, representing the customer in this story, what friction are they going to go through? And Microsoft, Microsoft may have actually been making money with the product, but they're like, you know what? This is no longer a viable product in the long term for whatever reason. And then they reduce the friction for their customers who were going to continue being Microsoft Office customers, Microsoft Windows customers, and Microsoft whatever else customers. They're like, how do we reduce the friction for our customers of money? And the obvious answer is, we'll help them go over to the new place. So I think as a product manager, you're looking at looking at friction, looking for friction in the buying cycle, looking for friction in the way people use our products. And in this context, looking for friction as they attempt to get off of our product. Friction.
I love that. Friction.
Unlaunching friction.
Unlaunching friction. He's trying to give us what we're going to do as our takeaways.
One thing to add though, like if you are killing off an entire product or an entire like segment of your product, think about what that's going to do to your teams. Do you have a migration path internally for those people? Is the expectation that you're just going to walk them all out the door? Think about the impact it has on the rest of your organization when you do that, because these are all humans.
That's a very good point. And I'm going to say something nice about Microsoft here. I strongly suspect that they were like, why are we taking this precious resource and working on money when we could redirect their skills into something more interesting and more profitable? It wasn't, we're losing money on this product. It's not hitting our KPIs.
It gets into portfolio management. We're going to shift those resources to something else.
It's the opportunity cost thing. You could use those resources for something far more profitable. That seems like a good idea.
That's the best way to solve it.
Yeah. Well, in the most humane way, right?
Right. Yeah.
If we care about people, obviously there are some companies out there that don't care about people and are willing to cut thousands at a time just to juice their stock price. But it is what it is. That's the decision of the shareholders there. Before we get to the wrap up, I had somebody ask me the other day, because I'd mentioned we were doing EOL, and they're like, how do you EOL a feature? Do you EOL features in your product? Is it a different thought pattern?
Same. Does it solve the problem? The same, right?
If it's not being used.
Yeah.
It's just a scale thing, right? If you launch a
Yeah.
feature, you might not do a press release. If you kill a
Yeah.
feature, you might not do a press release.
And this goes to the whole Pendo stat that 80% of features are rarely, if ever, used. It's like there's a lot of bloat out there in software. Does the idea of EOLing features actually help clean up what we have?
Perhaps we should do it more.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and the website tool that we use is very good at that. I've been very impressed with a lot of the product management behavior I've seen. They do continuous validation and get lots of feedback, and periodically they'll send a note saying, by the way, this service is not meeting the needs of our customers, and we're going to deprecate it while we reconsider what this feature should be or could be. Meanwhile, go over and use this other tool.
Yeah. So it just was something in my head that I wanted to get out there. Our final question: what's your biggest learning or takeaway from this conversation? Katya, biggest learning or takeaway?
Okay, sounds like a therapy, but I would say, like, if you're doing this, like, nothing wrong with you as a product manager. You're doing a great job. Because you have this question, right? You raise this question about, well, like what Steve talked like the whole hour, right? Are we solving the problem? Is it the right product for these customers? So that's like always come to this question, why? And that means you are doing a great job. And nothing wrong with end of life. It's like sunset, sunrise, sunrise, sunset. So that's.
I love it. Jon.
And now I have Fiddler on the Roof going through my head with the sunrise sunset thing. Sorry. Unlaunch for me is the big takeaway for the day. Like I love that idea of unlaunch or unwinding the thing.
Yeah. I love it too. May.
I think fundamentally we need to discuss this more as a discipline. Partly because as we talked about it, it's like we've never ever talked about it, might have been able to have this conversation in a group format 3 times, and you know how much I talk about product. So I think it's worthwhile to discuss, like, what does it mean to see if a feature is successful, and if that feature is unsuccessful, what do we do with it? And give that same treatment not just at a feature level, but feature, component, product, across the portfolio. Like, how do we make better strategic decisions based on what works, what's important, and what's actually costing you time?
Amen to that. My friend Steve.
Well, product management identifies problems worth solving. And when our solution isn't worth it anymore, time to unlaunch it. And as I said, I think that products and people are free agents. Every year we need to decide, is this player, serving the organization, and is this organization serving the player?
I love it. I think for me, I'm going to echo what Jon said with unlaunch. And not that I hadn't thought about it before, but Katya, with the whole understanding your agreements, understanding your contracts, right? This is there's so many other factors that sometimes we're not privy to, but do those and unlaunch. May.
With contracts, because your product's been out for a while, your current SLAs might not be the SLAs tying to all your customers. So double check those.
I love that.
Lesson learned.
Katya, Jon, May, Steve, thank you for this wonderful conversation. And thank you to everybody on LinkedIn who was commenting. Some really good conversations going on in the comments. That's one of the things I love about what's happened as we've been live streaming this. The quality of people in there, many of them have been on these panels before. So, if you're not on the panel, come join the conversation, the comments. We like doing that. Every week, I love the conversation. Every week, I learn more. And I appreciate you guys for helping me on that and with that. And in 2 weeks, we're going to do a special episode. We're bringing 2 of our good friends, Jason Knight and Saeed Khan on to talk about working with sales. So they've got a course they've been working on. And if you've never, well, most everybody has seen Jason because he's, his podcast, he's out there a ton. Saeed's one of my favorite people to talk with about product management in the world. And it's going to be an amazing conversation. There's no doubt about it. So that's in 2 weeks. And otherwise, we'll see you guys on LinkedIn. Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.